Bruce Ackerman, Tony Kronman, who interestingly enough are Democrats, so the father link is there, but very influential on Mid-East policy. So it must be one of the most marvelous feats, because somehow he convinces these Yale professors that he knows something about Islamic law. This would all be just gossip if it hadn't been for the fact that these Yale professors, through Feldman's wife's connections, convinced President Bush that Noah Feldman should be the legal advisor to the new Iraqi constitution. So Noah Feldman is this 24-year-old kid, right, who's going to advise Iraqis on their new constitution. And this was the beginning of the mess. And after, it just happened that he's Jewish and his father is also a rabbi. Now, the Iraqis soon discovered that these people that have doctorates from the Sorbonne and been jurists for 30-40 years, they have this little kid coming in, blonde, white, skinny, scrawny little kid coming in, lecturing them on
Islamic law,
and democracy and how Sharia could or could not be integrated in the constitution and so on and so forth. And after they complained long enough, Bush removed him. But gave him some other honorary title like advisor to something, the White House, and Feldman even wrote a book called What We Owe Iraq, published by Princeton Press, became very influential, and then now he wrote, hired by, there was a sort of a bidding war between the Yale Law School, Harvard Law School, and NYU Law School. And Harvard won the bidding war, and he wrote another book called Islam and State, which basically is a plagiarization of partly speaking God's name, partly what Halak's work, partly, but he basically says, well, Islamic law in the pre-modern world provided rule of law, and so these Muslims have a notion of rule of law, and
that's good.
this became a hugely influential book text, and so the rule of law notion is not completely absent from the Muslim mind, and to pretty much accurately paraphrase the way he even structures it, and he says, well, of course, now the trick is to convince them that the rule of law can be achieved by a legal system other than the Sharia. And then these Muslims will cooperate with us much more readily, Well, one of the significant things, the reason I bring up Noah Feldman is that in his book, which I've been asked to review, this in itself, talk about pedagogy. One of the law reviews in the United States picks the 100 most important books published in law every 5 years. Right? And they publish an issue where they ask scholars to write reviews on each scholar takes one of these books and writes a review on it. The only book picked on Islamic law or that deals with the Muslim world in the 100 list was Noah Feldman's text. And to Noah's bad luck, they asked me to review it. I haven't finished the review yet, but and I asked the editors, why was this book picked? He said, but we called around. We did our research, and we called around the law schools, we called around the State Department, the White House, and everyone told us the most important book to be published on Islamic law in the past 5 years is this book. So, we really did our homework. So, there you have it.
And they didn't talk to any Muslims.
No,
probably.
they didn't.
Which would be the most obvious thing they missed out.
They didn't talk a single professor of actual,
of Islamic studies,
of Islamic law, Islamic studies, or anything.
You need Western people to explain to you the Muslims because they can't speak for themselves.
Right.
Somebody that gets it has to explain it to you.
This is, but they're, and so Noah Feldman says, in a critical part of this book, he says that part of the problem with Muslims is, like the trouble with Islam, the part of or what went wrong, it's like you could translate it like, what's wrong with Islam. Part of the problem with Muslims is that they always blame colonialism for everything, and they should get over it, grow up. Colonialism was not any more intrusive upon the world than Ottoman colonialism, and Western colonialism and Ottoman colonialism pretty much it's a wash type thing. And with the Muslims, if they stop blaming colonialism, and of course, can you guess who else? There's always stop blaming colonialism and another country. Israel.
Yeah.
If they stop
Don't blame Israel also.
If Muslims would stop blaming colonialism in Israel for their problems, then Muslims would start looking inwards and examining their own cultures, and they might get somewhere. Now, of course, there's a historical problem here, is that what remains of that Muslim cultural heritage after colonialism, and one of the if you start getting the impression that all I do in my life is read books, you pretty much understand, because I can't seem to go 2 minutes without mentioning some book. A fellow called Yuan Cole wrote. Yuan Cole, he is a professor at the University of Michigan, and he wrote a reasonable book. It's called Engaging the Muslim World. He's trying to respond to a lot of the Islam bashing in the U.S. But Yuan Cole says something in there that caught my attention. It was very interesting. Is that he said that, and by the way, Yuan Cole is not one of those people who are. He says stop blaming the Wahhabis. They're not. So he's actually not against the Wahhabis and doesn't think that they're a problem. But anyway, one of the things that he says is that he concedes that the Wahhabis in the 1970s made a concerted effort to become the leaders of the Muslim world. But the really surprising bit of information that he supplied that truly surprised me was that it was President Roosevelt's idea. That that the Saudis actually saw themselves as a far more limited regional. In fact, it was very few. Not even they had attitudinally they were conceding leadership of the Arab Muslim world to Egypt, and President Roosevelt and his advisors who came in and said, no, it is you who should lead the Muslim world because you have Mecca and Medina and you have the resources and of course what he liked about Saudi theology is that it was very focused on orthodoxy, but was not focused on colonial resistance or national liberation or self-determination. The Saudis, other than freeing Mecca and Medina from the hands of the Ottomans, who they considered heretics, there was that's it. They had so then. Interestingly enough, Yuan Ko provides information as to how the Roosevelt administration went about even enabling and helping the Saudis wrap up the Muslim world, and the same idea of the same dictatorial sort of paradigm, and that if you deal with these countries that are led democratically, then you have to deal with many competing interests. But if you deal with a country that is led by a dictator, then you deal with just the wishes of that one dictator, and you get your, so it's much easier to get contracts for your oil companies, to get economic concessions, etc., etc. You don't have someone that keeps saying, well, I need to go back to my parliament and see if they'll approve this or approve that, or so on and so forth. And the idea was that Saudi Arabia would play this role of opposing Arab nationalism, the Nasserist Arab nationalism, and at the same time, through leading the Muslim world, deliver the Muslim world into a position that is more cooperative with American interests. So going back to this question is, well, I have often wondered about our intellectual rootedness and connection to what we can call the native cultures from which we emerged. I know in my case, and I would be really interested in knowing your own experiences, because you also come from a very different setting. In my case, because I grew up in a subculture of sheikhs and focus on fiqh and tafsir and hadith and so on, I've actually always felt like an outsider as an outlier in Egypt, an outlier to the power structure, an outlier to the intelligentsia, an outlier to even when I turn on the television. I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Egyptian movie industry, but when I was growing up, the thing that the Egyptian movies made it to the point to show everyone drinking alcohol and sleeping around, and the cool thing was to know the latest dances, the cha-cha-cha and the mambo and I don't know what, and and it remains pretty much like this. So now, but even what I soon discovered, that where I thought I would find a niche, i.e. among the Islamic activists, because I was raised textually, I found again myself very alienated, because these activists seemed to be mostly engineers and computer scientists and so on. In other words, they were not in that. And second, they were far more a post-colonial reaction. They were far more about reacting to colonialism and the legacy of colonialism than an interest in anything within the Islamic tradition itself. I mean, I don't know, do you have anything like that in Indonesia or in...
Yeah, I think the same thing.
Really? So, I mean...
yeah, respecting the colonial legacy rather than trying to explore the tradition or the native values or... Yeah.
But part of this is that when you are intellectually try to protect when your posture is a defensive one, and against like the writings of Galal Kishki, the cultural invasion, or the very famous book, a very influential book at one time, it was called Akhtar min al-Naksa, more dangerous than the 67 defeat, and that is the cultural, the intellectual defeat. The defensive posture, by necessity, will make you idealize, sanctify, and instead of feeling how do I put this? When I read Muslim intellectuals of the past, the thing that always strikes me is that there is a remarkable sense of confidence and feeling of control that they negotiate with the Islamic tradition, not worried about whether this tradition is too weak to, they're not worried about breaking the tradition and the withering away of the tradition and sort of flying off in the air. For instance, some of the what we were talking about yesterday, recording reports, many of which could have very suspect origins, preserving various extinct schools of thought in Islamic law. That's a fascinating sociological and historical practice in itself, in that a jurist would preserve the views of all the so many schools of thought. We don't know them through their texts, which are lost or unpublished, but we know them because of how the opinions were preserved, and as well as whether they are open to or resistant to outside influences. The remarkable familiarity that they have with the tradition of the other. So, for instance, one of the I forgot now the name of the author. It's a book called Al-Radd ala Ahl al-Masih. Basically, it's a work of eschatology and apologetics. It's defending Islamic theology against Christian criticism and attacking Christian theology. But the work is massive. It's 3 volumes. It reminds me of Hans Kung's book on Islam. The author has clearly read Christian theologians in original sources and is conceding points of problematic points in Islamic thought, instead of trying to apologize for them or cover over them and so on. And this sense of intellectual daring clearly evaporates in the modern age. I mean, it's now either you are an insider defending the tradition, sanctifying the tradition, or you become a rebel against the tradition under the very sloppy and sweeping category of secularists, basically saying we need to replace this tradition, there's no use for it.
Is even the post-colonial Muslim culture is more uncreative than in the colonialism era? Is it like that?
I raised this question. I think that the Muslim, during the colonial era, I think there's Muslims, we have this prevailing notion of reform. This idea of reform. And I'm not sure that a lot of the ideas for quote unquote reform, whether they were reform in fact is debatable. I mean, whether, for instance, the answer to the technological backwardness of a particular country is whether there's maslahah in Sharia or not. First we'd have to talk about the role of law in society and what differences law make, etc., etc. But in the post-colonial era, what concerns me quite a bit is the absence of authenticity in the Islamic narrative. It's like I can't find the search for the authentic in the Islamic narrative, rather than the reactive in the Islamic narrative, becomes much harder. Muhammad Abdu, for instance, writing during the colonial era, seemed to be far less. If you read his book on Tawheed, he very liberally borrows from various theological orientations that are clearly not Ash'ari, arguably even some Mu'tazili thought, and he doesn't feel as much under pressure as intellectuals of today to either side as outside the Islamic tradition or solidly with the Islamic tradition. Even Qasim Amin, in his book on liberation of women, I mean, most of that book, a lot of people talk about this book, but the fact that actually people who read it, quite few. Qasim Amin, in his book of it is full of theological and jurisprudential arguments. And Qasim Amin, you're struck by the fact that he doesn't seem to be very well read in Islam, in feminist European tradition, despite his French education. But he is more familiar with the Islamic tradition than most of our contemporary writers. It seems that post-colonialism, as the positions became more polarized, negotiating the tradition itself, engaging it in a dynamic fashion, became more challenging and more difficult and more ideologically charged. Now, the question, though, is, okay, so what do we do next? If this is true, it cannot be that we simply diagnose a problem and then stop.
But is it possible, if it seems like what you're saying is that the Islamic tradition has been kind of reactive for a few hundred years now, that it's kind of on the defense, and I have to say I can't see how that would change. I mean, what could you really put forward that would change that, other than, consciousness raising amongst people so that they have a bit more of respect for the kind of classical Islamic tradition, which, perhaps is lost. The only thing I can think of would be an education on the part of Westerners that would, because otherwise, that's quite a massive social trend, for Muslims to sort of feel on the defensive and feel that they have to have these sturdy positions, which eliminates these, progressives or who are educated, or I don't know. Pessimistic.
Is it also possible because of after the colonialism, Muslim people sort of think that they have kind of weakness in kind of injuring in those of kinds, so that they kind of okay, that's our weakness, and then probably we can change it by understand and learn something like that, and by engineering something like that, they kind of leaving the Islamic traditions that been discouraged in the in the colonial era. So is it kind of there because our weakness is on that what the Western people do, so we have to copy, so have to use the thing like them, so we have to work like that. So for a while we have to forget our traditions.
Well, I mean, I certainly that's one orientation that's very prevalent, but I think that's exactly part of the problem, because I'm not. I mean, if I don't believe that it is very easy to abandon a tradition and then go back and reclaim it. It actually gets harder as time passes.
Yeah.
And that's why it's much harder to claim the intellectual tradition of the Egyptian pharaohs, or to date, but we can. One of the things that strikes me, I mean, I agree with you. It looks like okay, this is a very huge problem, and what can you possibly do about a problem that has developmental aspects, that has numerous political aspects, that has but I wonder about, in a very concrete fashion, why? How do I put this? One thought that and I'm not the first, of course. This is something, for instance, that Fadl Rahman has struggled with in the University of Chicago, and Muhammad Iqbal before him has struggled with, and so on, is to try to start a response of funding or attempting to raise enough awareness to provide for philanthropic funding. Who was it that was working on philanthropy? Yes. Philanthropic funding for a think tank like, or institute like particular kind of scholars who are committed to being rooted in negotiating modernity through the Islamic tradition, not but they are not, their primary issue is not either a critique of the West or a celebration of the West. Their primary issue is rereading, rediscovering the tradition, even in little incremental steps. Like, this is a discussion a long time ago I had with Fazl Rahman. I mean, Fazl Rahman was saying, how all these people that keep talking about modernity and the challenge of Islam and so on and so forth. SubhanAllah, I had this conversation with him the summer before he died. Just like 1 month before he died. And he was saying that how many institutes exist in the Muslim world that are backed up by philanthropy for the preservation of various trends and orientations of the Islamic tradition. Just the manuscript And it's in microfilming and putting it in technologically accessible forms and getting these texts that we often know nothing about. Even for a while, there's a professor at UCLA, she's retired now,